I'm always reminded of where there are speeches associated with dinners of 1979, which is a kind of a year in my own life which I think marked very profound generational change in Ireland of one sort or another. It was the year, for instance, the Pope visited Ireland. And I started in Maynooth, on the staff of Maynooth, the morning he arrived. There were 100,000 people in Maynooth to meet me. Interestingly, Maynooth thought then that this was the start of something new. And it was, but it wasn't something they thought it was starting. It was actually, like many good things which we do in Ireland, we usually do wakes much better than we do christenings. And the Pope's visit to Maynooth was actually a wake for 200 years of a particular worldview and particular institutional form in Ireland that was slipping away and would collapse very rapidly in the years thereafter. There was also a second wake held, which was for the Combat Poverty Agency. It was also 1979, and the first programme to combat poverty, which had been funded largely by European funds, 1974 to 1979, was very dramatic in its analysis and in its approach, in changing a very particular worldview of poverty and inequality in Ireland. At any rate, Charlie Haughey came to power and decided we didn't need it, and it was waked. And I remember at the dinner, which marked the end of the Combat Poverty Agency, the late Bishop Eamon Casey, he addressed the dinner a bit like now in the New Park Hotel in Kilkenny, and we had all partaken in the fullness as one can, a dinner in the New Park, and Casey stood up and he said, "If this is a conference on poverty, I can't wait for the one on celibacy." And, he didn't tell us that he had been at that conference as well, but that was neither here nor there. But I am interested. I think this was a period that did mark an axial shift in Ireland. And in my own work in the 80s, especially out of Maynooth, especially the new suburbs of Dublin, in West Dublin, in Clondalkin and Blanchardstown, and in some of the towns around Maynooth, we did multiple local development plans and local development surveys of one sort or another. And I remember Neilstown in the 1980s had an unemployment rate of 80%. So we were looking at a country in the 1980s that was in so many ways in Ireland on its knees. And it was kind of into that world the community and voluntary sector and civil society became so engaged. And in a way, it was the first time it ever became engaged with the really disadvantaged in Ireland. Because up to that, it had been primarily, though not entirely, and we could have an interesting discussion on this, I think. This sector, it had been primarily, but not entirely, working with, in a sense, more rural and maybe slightly better off, or with a sector that was more vested in things staying as they were. So I grew up in Tipperary, and that zone of Cork, Tipperary, Limerick, right through the 20th century, and maybe the late 19th century as well, it became expert at reinventing itself in many ways to make sure that things didn't change. So the rural voluntary sector became very powerful in those areas. Entities like Muintir na Tíre, established by Canon Hayes in the late 1930s from Bansha in Tipperary, Machran na Firma, established in the 1940s to work with young farmers, and then organisations like the IFA, the ICMSA, and even the GA. They all had, and to some extent as well, the ICA, all had their roots geographically and socially in a part of Ireland that had a certain sense of comfort with itself. Whereas the voluntary and community sector that was emerging in the 1980s and onwards was more urban, it was more working class, and it was more edgy. It was also more likely to be driven by women and to have a very strong feminist analysis coming to bear on it. So that sector emerged into a zone, into a geographical zone and into a social zone that was deeply disadvantaged, that had low levels of formal education in particular, and was hugely caught on that shift from the protected enterprises and the protected economy that Ireland had up to EU entry and the rapid opening up of the Irish economy and the demise of the native industrial employment sectors. So for all of those reasons in the 1980s, we saw an emergence of a new kind of project, of citizenry project in Ireland. So if we move into the current generation, what are things like now, and are there lessons, or what do we see the parallels? I think it is useful to look at the community and voluntary sector, which you might generally call civil society, as occupying a space between the state on the one side and the marketplace on the other. And at various times they move apart and come closer. But certainly since the 80s, the state and the notion of the state has come to be challenged fairly profoundly by a worldview that came to prominence in the personalities and in the personas of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in particular, which was a view that the state was overly intrusive, overly interventionist, needed to withdraw, and allow the marketplace to solve people's problems for them. And in a sense, that project has continued. And it has continued right up to the political agenda of the Conservative Party in the UK to this day, who have now a target of something in the high 30% of GDP, which of state expenditure. So the state is retrenching and freeing up the marketplace, and that process has been happening for nearly 30 years, driven very strongly by economic orthodoxy and by the orthodoxy of people who would feel that they are overtaxed and that public services are inefficient and that they're too costly and that they are a disincentive to endeavour. So in this debate, the marketplace has, in a sense, been allowed to take possession of territory that was once held by the state. And in Ireland, the three areas that are now contested on that particular axis, I think, as between state and marketplace, are housing and homelessness, health, and also education. And in all of those three areas, there is a political and ideological divide in Ireland and in Europe generally as to what is the respective role of the state and role of the marketplace in those three zones and in other zones as well. And if you look at that divide then, if there is a gap develops, is that where the community and voluntary sector steps in. My own sense of it is that as inequality grows in a society and globally, and according to some economists I was reading recently. I'm not sure how accurate this is, but this woman Raworth, who maintains now that 1% of the global population own 50% of global wealth. So in times of severe inequality, cohesion comes to be broken down, and the very question of citizenship begins to emerge as a serious issue for debate. And if you look at the fault lines of the Brexit vote and at the fault lines of the American election, in both instances, the issue of social class above any other issue was the decisive character of those who voted one way or the other. In the case of Donald Trump, for instance, it is now accepted that class has displaced race as the key fault line in America. In the case of the UK, the same was true for Brexit, where urban, disadvantaged and working class, and very particularly people with low levels of formal education, voted Brexit. So this fault line is beginning, I think, to demonstrate to the West especially that inequality is dangerous, because if you allow it to become more accentuated in a democracy, people will vote in perverse ways and they will make perverse political decisions. And while people will have views on Brexit, it is very difficult to see how Brexit is not a perverse decision. But people will do it when the state has deserted them and when the market has no place for them. And if you look at Grenfell Towers, or you look at the Highbury disaster nearly 30 years earlier, they both emerge from the same kind of philosophy which says that poor people do not have to be taken care of. And if you risk that, not only will the poor people suffer, but what has come as a shock, I think, to policymakers in Europe is that actually they have the capacity to pull the rug on the whole project. And so this is why I think your sector has such a critical role to play. And in a sense, part of the question I think that has to be asked is, can you do it? Can you actually substitute for the state or the marketplace? Or do you better draw your energy or direct your energy to campaigning as opposed to actually directly intervening? That's a strategic decision that you will, in a sense, that you will have to make. But I do think it is an important one. I will make two other points about the future and where you sit in it, in the shaping of the next generation. I think I'm interested in the notion, obviously, of education. I spent my life in it, both formally and informally. And I think I've known instinctively all my life that if we rely on the formal systems for education, it's going to be inadequate. Now, we have had a whole range of devices and ways in our ambient social environment whereby young people can learn in places outside of school. And not only young people, but also adults. I would think, for instance, I could think when I meet primary teachers, one of the things they all tell me is the first thing they have to teach a child in primary school, first day or two in primary school now, is they put a cord down through the classroom and try to get them to walk in a straight line. Because children are now turning up into schools in Ireland where they haven't actually learned how to do that. They haven't walked on walls. They've possibly been growing up in walkers. They mightn't even have crawled. They usually don't know how to fall. And then they can go into schools in Ireland, and I'm on the board of management of one of them. There are 900 children in this school. They occupy a 3-acre site. And at lunchtime, they are not allowed to run in the playground because it is dangerous. So when a child cannot run, we can fairly safely assume that learning is somehow constrained. So it seems to me that we need to check our environment around its capacity to create learning moments for children and adults. Putnam, who writes a lot about this area, he talks about meals together. And it's a very interesting thing that, again, having family dinner is increasingly a middle-class activity. A family dinner isn't just about taking on petrol. It is where you debrief. It's where you spend quality time. It's where you imbibe a worldview. It's where political opinions are developed and fought out. It's where parents begin to get to know their children and vice versa. But if that is happening on the run, that entire learning experience is missed out. So I do believe that this sector that you are part of, whether it's in youth work, whether it's in early life education, whether it's in extracurricular or out-of-school activities, whether it's in youth work, the educational and social development project there is so profound in a context where we are finding it increasingly difficult in the neighbourhood to actually provide a positive educational experience for children. And then the last point, and the last generational challenge I want to present to you, is the environmental one. As Deirdre mentioned, I have an involvement in water, but that's neither here nor there. I'm interested in the whole issue of civil society around the question of the environmental challenge. Looking back at history, human civilization, it seems to me, has always been confronted with challenges. And the odd thing about them is it has always overcome them. And I think growing up in Ireland in the 60s, and it wasn't a great place to grow up in, but you knew for sure that the 70s would be better. And you had such a profound sense of optimism that the future was opening up and the future was bright. Now you knew that you needed to educate, to do education, and you need to do some things, but that if you made a fair effort, this society was going to reward you. I think what is unique about young people today is they're growing up without a sense of the inevitability of progress. And this is such a profoundly serious issue if that is the case. If they feel that the ice is thinning under their feet, then issues of investment in the future come absolutely into the question. And investment in my future, which is about my own mental health, my well-being, my sense of optimism, will be shaped by what's happening out there on the environmental question. This generation, must now deal with what are referred to as the 4 planetary boundaries of environmental degradation. They are climate change, the chemical pollution of soils and of the world generally, the acidification of the oceans, and the ongoing loss of biodiversity. So we have these 4 phenomena that are all part of my generation. And I'm interested in water because I see it partly as the bloodstream of an ecosystem. But I've now concluded that actually you can get it clean, and the EPA, and we have the EPA here are doing such a brilliant job now nationally in capturing the pressures on Irish water systems. We have nearly 5,000 river catchments in Ireland. 1,300 of them are polluted as we speak, are at risk as we speak. But I've now concluded that water alone doesn't deal with it. We have to deal with soil, we have to deal with air, and we have to deal with the sea. The Marine Institute now say that mussels are finding it difficult to form their shells in Kilrea Harbour because of the acidification of the oceans. So this generation is leaving an incredible planetary mess for the next generation. We're at 0.8% of global warming above average for the past 10,000 years. I am told there has been more temperature change on the planet in the past 30 years than in the previous 100,000 years. So this democratic project that you're involved in, I think it has to capture the environmental challenge, the challenge that is literally threatening the very earth, and not only threatening the earth, but threatening children's sense that they have a future on the earth. So in summary, I am presenting you with three challenges. I think the civic and the citizen challenge is one of questioning your role in a context of the marketplace failures and the state withdrawal, and what you can do in that gap. What is your role in that gap? Because that gap is there and it will undoubtedly widen. I think the second one is building people with agency, building young people and adults with a sense that through your organisations, and if you look at them in Irish history, you will find they always did three things. They gave those who were members of them a sense of identity, i.e., I knew I was from Tipperary. I knew that through the GAA. More importantly, I knew I was not from Cork. This was important to my sense of identity. Prior to that, if you look at so much of the literature of revolutionary Ireland, you can see the shaping of a nation in organisations like the Gaelic League and indeed like the GAA. So a sense of identity. The other thing they gave them was a sense of cultural celebration, a sense of empowerment, of a positive sense of well-being. And thirdly, your organisations gave people, individuals, a sense of agency. That is, I can impact positively on my life and on the life of others. And that is your second challenge. And I think your third one, the third big democratic challenge confronting the world, is the democratic project of saving the world. And maybe that's a good way of leaving with you. Thanks very much.